Alright, welcome guys. So today I want to show you how to do hair and eyebrows in your model. So far we've just gone through the modeling phase, and so hopefully you've got your head model. As you can see, I'm going to use the same technique as I suggested you guys use for clothes or armor, which is to duplicate your model, select the section of that model, invert your selection, and then delete the rest of the model, just leaving behind a duplicate portion of the part that you want to lay on top. So what I'm just going to do is, once I have that separate object, I'm going to just clean up the edges to give it more of the hairstyle kind of shape that I want. And my next step for my case, since my character had spiky hair, I just used an extrude to pull out all of those spikes, and I turned off keep faces together, which gave me the option of creating kind of a whole lot of little individual spikes. If your character had kind of solid hair, right, you could keep those faces together and it would produce a different result. My character also has bangs that hang down the front of his face in kind of spikes that hang over his forehead. So now I had to go into Photoshop to start creating the actual hair strands. I created a small file, I think it was actually a 1024 by 1024 square pixels, and I just got a scratchy brush with lots of different strands. It has about 10 different dots inside that brush, right? And I just started creating clumps of hair. So in my case, my character's hair is black. Notice that I am working on a layer above the background, and I also have to check to make sure that it's not too see-through, right? So I turn off the background just because that fills in a lot of the gaps, so that I could see just how dark it's going to be once the image is see-through. I continue making different shape clumps, right? Trying to layer on enough color there so that they stay nice and dark in the middle. And then on the edges, they kind of have more of a feathered or softer look. I also experimented a little bit with using some of the different built-in brush variation, right? Where it's good to add a few highlights. I don't leave it just like this though. I go back over it once I have a bit of color variation or brightness variation in there, and mask some of that with another layer of dark colors, right? So you kind of create the same sort of layer effect that hair has just by switching between darker and lighter colors. If you have any sort of color hair, refer back to those color orbs that I posted in the chat to get an idea of different contrasting colors to use with your color, right? So if you say if you have brown hair, you may not just want to use lighter and darker shades of brown. That might give you a bit of a muddy look. You might want to throw some other colors in there, like a little bit more orange or something for the highlights, or a bit like purplish red, right, would give you more of an auburn hair color. So don't be afraid of adding a bit of color in there. It's just my character does have jet black hair. Next thing I want to do is just to check that the ends are solid enough, because the top end, in my case, of these strands are going to be pushed into the base of the head, into that model geometry. And then these are going to stick out as new planes on the character. So back in Maya, I set up a new material with this Photoshop file as my color file. It's okay to use Photoshop for my balloon texture. However, I still need to set up a opacity file, just since I'm using Blend. Blend didn't like me using a Photoshop document for the transparency texture. So I assigned the hairs to a new plane, and then I cut up the plane much in the same way that I would say cut up. Actually, that was the first year's class that made the weapon. So I cut up a plane with these individual strands and then duplicated a few times and separate out the different pieces so that I have each of these three as separate clumps. And then I also want to add a few cross cuts so that I can bend those planes. So I typically make each clump of hair those three polygons. Right, so my next step here is just to bring a clump into place so I can see what it's going to look like once I have the transparency. And I'll show you here how I shape it. Right, I can just use face mode or vertex mode to bend that clump to give it a bit of a softer feel. Then back in the transparency slot, I need to create an alpha channel for this texture. So remember, alpha channels display anything that's white and hide anything that is black. So since I have black strands of hair, I'm just going to create the alpha channel out of these by inverting what I have already. So first I'm just going to, you can see I decrease the brightness a whole bunch of times, and then I invert the colors. That gives me those white strands that I can then apply onto that blend material. And once I apply that, I also just want to drag down my specular color so I don't get that reflection. But you see, I still have an issue where the edges are a bit softer, a little bit shiny. So I do go back into my alpha channel texture and I kind of do a reverse brushing there. So I brush from upwards from the bottom, right, to maintain that kind of those hairy edges, right, the little flayed edges. But I keep the middle of it pretty solid, and there you can see when I go back into my the edges are a bit cleaner. So in this case, I've just created, one strand for demo purposes. What I would really do is work on at least like say 4 or 5 variations of this one so that I can get a little more variety. But just to show you guys what you'll start doing once you have those hairs in place, right, is you start moving them around, resizing some of them, and twisting them. You can move some vertices around as well, right? Since this texture is already mapped on there, you don't super have to worry about placement of the texture pieces. But in a perfect world, right, what we would do is have this almost after we've UV unwrapped the character, we would have a section of the character or a section of the UV map kind of saved for the hair region. That way we can just kind of take these pieces and I'll put them in one place and then put this hair texture piece onto the edge of the character. So again, on the next little strand, right, I decided I want more variety, so I went back and cleaned up the edges of this more kind of spike shaped strand, making sure that there wasn't as much gray on the very perimeter, right, so that I'm not getting too much of that ghostly effect on the edges. I'm saving this down as a JPEG, and since it is already in the correct slot in my bloom texture, all I need to do is open and close the Hypershade editor to refresh that. Then I make a duplicate strand. I'm holding D to move the pivot point and then make a few copies of this one and start to play with the shapes and the bends of the hair strand. So depending on the complexity of your hair, you could end up spending a lot of time on this, right? So generally the recommendation is to do the biggest portions of the hair using geometry. Kind of like my hair spikes are done. I'm actually gonna have to take another look at my hair spikes. Like I mentioned in the chat, they're a bit too high poly at the moment. But this is a way that you do hair in games, right? Is you use alpha channel and very low polygon planes just to give the illusion of multiple strands. So in my case, I've just used kind of clumps here for this fringe area, but you could really have planes that are just holding like 3 hairs, right? If your character does have very stringy hair, you don't necessarily want to have very large chunks like braids or anything like that done in this method. You would actually model those out as geometry. But for the majority of the time, you can plan ahead to kind of figure out what you need in terms of hair clumps, right, and work on those in Photoshop. If you don't have a Wacom or you want to go for a simpler route, don't be afraid to just go and look for high resolution photos of people's hair online, right? Next piece I wanted to look at was the eyebrows, and I thought I would do a test, with the hair clumps that I have. But you can see right away it just isn't really working in that area because the flow of the strands across the eyebrows is not just left and right. Yeah, the eyebrow hairs actually have to kind of travel upwards before they travel to the side. So just for a shape though, I did a quick test to see if that same black color was going to work for the eyebrows. Then decided, hey, I should just go back and draw those into my texture, and that way I can use the same texture for everything. Use the same method, giving it a little bit of variation, but really the important part was getting into the alpha channel and cleaning up those edges. Yeah. Then once I've completed the new alpha map, right, I had saved my color map down. I was just working with a PSD for the color map, so I just need to save that, but I didn't need to do a save as on the alpha channel. Add a bit more color variation here just to see if I can shake it up a little bit, right? See if it needs a little bit more variety. And once I've worked out the color on the eyebrows, I just use the same exact method to apply that to a plane, right? It's going to have the same texture as the hair chunks. So I just create a new plane, set the subdivisions to 1 and 1, apply that texture, right? And then I can just cut the eyebrow out using the multi-cut tool. I want to make sure that I have the same number of cuts on each side, and then I just delete the surrounding polygons, right, making sure that I make those splits down the middle. That way I can curve it, and once I put it into place, like, the character starts to come together a little bit, so it started to feel a little bit more human at this stage. Ideally, what I would actually do here, right, is to try and have my cuts match the facial geometry. So yeah, in a perfect world, I would just go back to my my face model, pull a piece of geometry off of that eyebrow area, maybe using the same method of selecting, duplicating and then deleting the rest of the model, and then applying that texture onto that one little segment. The only thing is then I would have to worry about cleaning up my UVs a little bit. So my last step, I just decided to take a look and see if it worked with the hair as a model in place there. And that's what I got you guys for hair. So my last step, right, was to just have it be so that I could manipulate both sides of the model at the same time. I just did a duplicate special with a scale of -1, but since that piece was rotated, it ended up being a bit more tricky than I guessed. But having a duplicate special is nice because then if you make any changes on one, they will appear on the other side. Alright, good luck guys. Let me know if you have questions.